Hi, Robert. It looks like we're the first ones on the Zoom.
You are, but there'll be more in just a moment.
And why are we spotlighted?
I'll fix it in 1 sec.
Okay, no problem. We get to look at each other. Thank you again for doing all this.
Good evening, everybody. I invite everybody to take a breath in and a breath out. And just be present here in this moment, in this room together. As we gather here today to observe Yom HaShoa, we are united in our commitment to remember the lives lost during the Holocaust. On this solemn day, we bear witness to the unspeakable tragedy that befell not only the 6 million Jews who perished, but also countless others, including members of the LGBTQ community, Romani people, people with disabilities, and all those who were targeted and deemed undesirable by a hateful regime. In our remembrance, we seek to honor the memory of the victims and uplift the stories of resilience, courage, and hope that emerged even amidst the darkest chapters of human history. We are called upon to infuse this day with a spirit of deep reflection, loving kindness, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Through our collective memories and shared experiences, we connect with the souls of those who perished and reaffirm our pledge to ensure that their stories are never forgotten. We acknowledge the sacred responsibility that rests upon us as individuals and as a community to stand against hatred, discrimination, and indifference in all its forms, and to work towards a more compassionate and just world for all. As we embark on this spiritual journey together, let us hold space for the profound emotions that this day evokes, allowing ourselves to feel the weight of grief and the power of love that binds us together. In doing so, may we find the strength and inspiration to carry forth the legacy of those who are no longer with us and honor their memory by living lives guided by empathy, understanding, and the pursuit of tikkun olam, repairing the world. We're going to pause now for a moment of silence. I'm reading tonight from this packet here that Galit is making more copies of presently. As we pause for this moment of silence, let us open our hearts and our minds to the enormity of the Holocaust, if that's even possible, and the suffering it caused. Let us remember the countless lives that were lost and hold their memory close to our hearts. In this sacred silence, we honor their existence and acknowledge the profound impact of their absence. Have about a minute of silence. We're now going to invite 6 members of our community to come forward and light yahrzeit candles in honor of the 6 million who perished during the Holocaust. Each candle represents 1 million souls whose lives were tragically cut short and whose memory we are here to honor. And as a poignant reminder of the 1.5 million innocent children who were among those lost, we will ask the children present today to come join us to light one of the candles, the last candle. Through this act, we will symbolically connect the past with the present and the future, ensuring that the memories of those lost will continue to be passed down through the generations. After we light the candles, we'll have another moment of silence, some more prayers, and then we'll hear some stories of people who either had family members or themselves experienced the Holocaust. I'd like to ask for somebody to come and light the first candle. Bernie, do you want to light the first candle? I'd like to ask everybody to please rise while we light the candles. Volunteer for the next candle. And now any children who'd like to come forward in memory of the 1.5 million children who perished. How did you first go since you just became a woman? Are you comfortable with lighting a candle? There you go. Your voice. Thank you. You can be seated. We sit for another moment of silence. Once more, let us observe a moment of silence as we stand in the light of these yahrzeit candles. May their warm glow inspire us to honor the memory of the 6 million and to commit ourselves to creating a world where such atrocities can never happen again. We'll sit for another minute. Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, hachol v'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, v'rak hashamayim, tfilat ha'adam, Achol v'hayam rishru shel hamayim v'rak hashamayim tfilat ha'adam. O Lord, my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart. I'd like to now invite Gabe to read the butterfly poem on page 4.
The last, the very last, so richly, brightly, dazzlingly yellow, perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against a white stone. Such a yellow is carried lightly way up high. It went away, I'm sure, because it wished to kiss the world goodbye. For 7 weeks I've lived here, penned up inside this ghetto, but I have found my people here. The dandelions call to me, and the white chestnut candles in the court. Only I never saw another butterfly. The butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto.
Thank you. We get another volunteer to read this quote on page 5. Come forward.
First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
Thank you. We're now going to invite our speakers forward. Bernie, I'd like to invite you first to speak about your star and its story.
Good evening. I've been bringing this star, which was my mother had to wear in Paris before the deportations began. She was originally from Poland, so was my father, from the same town, and her family went to France in the early 20s. My cousin did some research. My mother was one of 9 siblings. And my cousin did some research and said to me, I don't know if I was verified, that her family, with all 9 siblings, was the only French family in Paris to survive without losing someone. And my grandparents stayed in Paris during the entire time and survived. When the deportations began, my mother's siblings, all 9, scattered throughout France, southern France, where the Nazis were not yet occupying, and lived with her brother, who's a woman named Madame Vaux. And I like to, as people have known in previous ceremonies, I want to concentrate on those that define the evil represented by the star. She and my uncle, Jacques, stayed with a woman who had a farm. And the town was Charlène-sur-Saône, which was halfway between Dijon and Lyon. And there they stayed until Paris was freed. And they all then regathered back in Paris. And the end of the story is my mother came to the United States, married my father, who was in the US Army. And she continued to have a correspondence with Madame Vo. And then Madame Vo died. And my uncle called my mother to tell her that not only had Madame Vo died, but she left the entire farm and all its belongings to my mother and my uncle. This was one of the righteous Gentiles who, during this dark period, saw fit to defy the Nazis and the collaborationist French to help Jewish fellow citizens survive the Holocaust. And I always ask myself, if I'm in that situation, I think we all have to ask ourselves, will we have the courage to defy and help those that are being persecuted? The other part is my father was also one of 8 siblings. They all survived except one sister who died with her husband and 2 young daughters in Auschwitz. So it's important, I think, that in this time, when we see all the violence going on in the world, that we sit back and commit ourselves to try to be one of those righteous people that helps fight this persecution.
Thank you for sharing your story. Aaron, would you like to come forward? And maybe Katrine is her name. Might want to play a little something on the violin. Hold on. You can only speak into the microphone so that everybody can hear you.
So I always wanted to get to know my grandmother, and I never had the opportunity to meet her, obviously, because her terribly sad ending, demise, also in Auschwitz. So from a passport photo, I tried to paint a portrait of how she would really look. I am blessed to have had a copy of the last letter. I do not read or speak German. But this is a copy of the last letter that she wrote to her 3 children, knowing that she wasn't going to survive. Someone who knows German might want to translate it for me. I know the last sentence was asking her kids to always remember to give tzedakah or charity, no matter where they were in life. She was a great artist from what I can put together. And this is a simple copy of a sketch she made of herself. So, and this is record that my brother found of her life and death in Auschwitz. Before I go on about her, I promised some of my students who couldn't be here tonight, who created beautiful artwork and poems. Here's one student created a shirt with the art. Another student wrote a story about her own grandfather. She wrote Zadie and drew a picture of him and said, in World War II, my Zadie was part of the army group who liberated a prison camp. Now he is 98 years old. His birthday is April 13th, 1925, and he is the best thumb wars person I know. And finally, a student drew a magnificent picture. These are 5th and 6th graders, of an arm with a number on it. And we were trying to figure out what would be a significant number to write. And she had remembered the story we read last year, a true story of Hannah Brady that a lot of my students know, who didn't unfortunately make it. We decided to put her birthday as the number on her arm as a tribute to her. And really, really magnificent. And okay, so one of the things I wanted to say about my grandmother is she was very prescient in 1933. after reading the book Mein Kampf, she moved her family to Holland from Germany. And unfortunately, it didn't help for her, but she was able to save her 3 children by sending them away. And just a little bit, I don't know that much about her because I was always careful not to ask my father too much because it was so painful for him. But as a child, he played violin, and she and her husband bought him a violin at auction. It was a Hungarian, I believe, violin. I'm not so sure of its history, but he played it as a child until he obviously no longer could do such pastimes and had to concentrate on saving his life and trying to save his parents' life. He escaped to America, and he was able to actually get them a visa, but it was 2 weeks too late. The Nazis took over Amsterdam where they were hiding. Few years after the war, when my father was in America, he gets a package in the mail, big box. He had no idea what it is. He opens it up, and it's his childhood violin. He had no idea that his mother had buried it in the garden of where she was hiding. But an uncle who survived knew about it and sent it to my father. He took it out. He played the Hatikva, and he played Star Spangled Banner, and the top caved in. And my mother decided she was going to take a year of her teacher's salary and get it fixed. And both daughters became violinists, and one played it for most of her time. I don't know if she's here, but.
Karina, are you going to play?
Hi, yes.
Thank you so much. It sounded beautiful to all of us here.
Thank you.
Yeah, Peter Bolges, would you like to come forward and speak now? Do you need a chair? Or do you want to come to the bima? How would you like to speak? You can stand. If you feel like you need to sit, let me know and I'll get you a chair. Right into the mic. You know what? Can you come up to the bima? That way we can have both mics on you. What's that? There we go.
A little more so you're not in the edge.
Oops, sorry. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Peter Volges. I'm 91 years old, and I reside in Rye, New York. I am here by the virtue of two fortunate developments. One, that as a 13-year-old boy, I survived the Holocaust in Hungary that took place in 1944 and early 1945. And two, that I immigrated to the United States by escaping from Hungary after the anti-communist revolution in that country was defeated in 1956. Although I am here to tell my own story and that of my two families during the Holocaust, I must give a brief historical background. Hungary signed the tripartite agreement in 1940 when I was 9 years old. Shortly after it was originated by Germany, Italy, and Japan, and thereby became part of the Axis powers, and it remained an ally of Germany throughout the Second World War. But much before that date, there was widespread anti-Semitism in Hungary. Laws were passed in the 1920s concerning Jewish participation in the practice of the professions and the number of Jews accepted at the universities. Hungary passed laws in the 1930s restricting Jewish participation in the trades, in public employment, in the country's cultural life, and concerning the ownership, participation. There were no laws curtailing physical movement or laws directly endangering life and limb concerning the general Jewish population. Starting in 1940, however, it was required that instead of serving as regular soldiers, Jewish men of military age serve in labor battalions to build roads, airports, work in mines, build defensive lines, tank traps, and other type of fortifications. These units were part of the military, but these men were not outfitted with military gear. They had to wear their own clothes, provide their own boots and blankets, and they carried no arms. Some of the battalions served stateside, and some were sent to Serbia or other German-occupied countries and territories to the east and south. Of the units sent to the Russian front, few, if any, survived. Some units, the ones that still existed toward the end of the war, were ordered to move west and ended up in concentration camps or met their demise in other terrible ways. I will speak more of this later. While in the early years of the war, the Jews of German-occupied Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland were deported to concentration camps, the Jews of independent Hungary were not exposed to such activities. In fact, some of the Jews of those countries ran to Hungary to save themselves. It even worked for a while. But on March 19, 1944, Germany militarily occupied Hungary, ending the country's de facto independence, and for the Jewish population, all hell broke loose. Adolf Eichmann and his gang came to Hungary to execute the final solution. They were actively supported by the Hungarian fascist party called the Arrow Cross Party and their local supporters, especially the gendarmerie, the state police operating in the countryside. The ghettoization and deportation of the Jewish population began, and by the middle of June 1944, 3 months after the beginning of the occupation, the Hungarian countryside was void of Jews, most of them deported to Auschwitz. Eventually, according to estimates, 400,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered. But I and my family lived in the capital city, Budapest, and our stories are different from the people who lived in the countryside. Before I get into the chronology of the events, I want to state the outcome of the Holocaust on my two families, my father's family and my mother's family, and thereby try to share with you my life's major quandary to which I have not found an answer, and I don't think I ever will. My father passed away 4 years before all this happened, so I spent the 10 months of the full length of the time of the Hungarian Holocaust living with my members of my mother's family, that is my mother, my brother, aunts and uncles on my mother's side, and my grandmother. 12 people all told. We all survived. Of my father's family, however, my grandfather, uncles and aunts, and cousins, numbering coincidentally also 12, half of them, 6 of them perished during the Holocaust. Both families lived in the capital city, Budapest. Both families were apartment dwellers in close-by neighborhoods. They were approximately the same age and lived under comparable economic circumstances. What made for the different outcome? I have no satisfactory explanation for it. Another comparison is equally unfathomable, yet true. There were 7 people in each family who either served in forced labor battalions or were deported. Yet in my mother's family, 6 of the 7 survived, when in my father's family, 6 of the 7 perished, including my favorite cousin George, who was only 18 years old. Explanation? There is none. Life and death in those days were totally random. My own story starts really 2 or 3 years earlier. I was a Cub Scout at the time. As many public activities in those days, the Boy Scouts and Cub Scout movement was also split along religious lines. And in 1941 or 42, the Jewish Boys and Club Scout groups were officially declared illegal. So for all intents and purposes, we went underground. This meant that we could not wear the uniforms, use the usual flags, or sing the usual songs. As unimportant as it sounds now, it was the beginning of the troubles for all us kids, and we knew it. So we kept meeting as an after-school hiking club, but we're no longer Boy Scouts, and that was very painful for us all. I remember it very clearly, how it happened, where it happened. So we kept hiking on weekends without uniforms and without flags. And we were hiking in the mountains surrounding the city on March 19, 1944, on a Sunday when the German army executed the military maneuvers necessary to occupy Hungary, including major troop movements in Budapest. Of course, while hiking in the woods, we were unaware of those activities. When in late afternoon, we tried to get on the commuter train to get back to the city, we were not allowed to embark, specifically because we were Jews. We were told so by the uniformed Boy Scouts, who did have their flags and all, who were manning the train specifically for this purpose. So we had to walk halfway back home. That's how the Holocaust started for me. I was 12 years old. All sorts of laws, rules, and regulations were put into effect that curbed the everyday activities of Jews. The employment of non-Jewish persons by Jews was prohibited. Curfews were established even for the daytime hours for the Jewish population, and for them, travel was restricted to the rear cars and rear stairs of all public transportation vehicles, streetcars, buses, and trolleys. All Jewish-owned vehicles were to be either sold or relinquished to the police. Very few people had cars and motorcycles, but my brother had a bicycle, which, as required, had been registered, and now his beautiful bike had to be handed in to the police, for which they gave him a receipt. All Jewish businesses had to close. By April 15th, all Jewish persons had to wear a yellow Star of David in public, permanently sewed to their outer garment for identification. By May 15, all Jewish persons had to move to designated buildings in the city, each marked with a large yellow Star of David. The city, with 1.2 million total inhabitants, had approximately 185 Jewish residents, and taking my family as an example, about 2/3 of the 185,000, or about 120,000 people, about 10% of the population, were dislocated and had to move to different dwellings. The building we lived in was not so designated, so we moved to my grandmother's apartment, who had shared it up to that time with two of her daughters and their husbands. By the designated date, her apartment accommodated 15 people, 12 family members, and 3 friends. The 3-bedroom apartment had a foyer and a maid's room, a kitchen, but had only 1 bathroom, not very comfortable, but not to be terrible either. Things got much worse, much more overcrowded later on. The government took possession of all abandoned apartments, ours as well. They gave us a receipt and locked the premises. We left everything behind except some clothing. Every apartment and every building had to have a commandant. My uncle Alex, being our apartment commandant, had a bit more freedom of movement than the rest of us. He would receive orders, rules, and regulations throughout the building commandment and was more aware of what was going on in the outside world. From time to time, he would advise that people not leave the building or to be extra cautious if they did, because there was increased activity by the member of the Hungarian Nazi party called the Arrow Cross Party to capture Jews randomly on the streets for deportation. Walking the streets was a constant danger, but sometimes it was more hazardous than usual. The forced labor service presented a constant danger and anxiety for our entire family. Uncle John and Uncle Steve were away. We didn't know where they were stationed, and we never heard any news from them until the war was over. Uncle Joe, being a tailor, worked in a local factory making uniforms and came home for every overnight stay every now and then, but eventually was sent into concentration camp from where he returned only after the war. Uncle Farkas, who managed to avoid forced labor in the early 1940s, couldn't evade it any longer and was away for a long time and came home very sick one day, needing several weeks of medical treatment and recovery. Uncle Alex and my brother Andy were required again and again to report for work duty of various types, sometimes being allowed to spend the night at home, but sometimes they were away for a couple of days or even weeks. There were frequent air raids during the night, as there was also a war going on. Everyone had a small bag to carry to the cellar in case of an air raid. Every family had a flashlight to use at night, as the building lights were disconnected. We rarely got totally undressed when we went to sleep in order to get ready faster if we had to respond to the air raid sirens. Of course, the cellar was hopelessly overcrowded because the whole building was overcrowded. One day in July, we noticed unusual commotion in the apartments in the building across the street. Soon we learned why. Uncle Alex stood at the window for a few minutes, turned his face ashen, and said, "Let's prepare. We are being taken away." A group of Hungarian soldiers and civilians wearing Arrow Cross armbands entered our building. We heard shouts, "Everybody to the courtyard," and line up in the courtyard, and one package per person, and more, move it. After discerning 3 flights of stairs and trying to keep the family together, we reached the courtyard. Eventually, every Jewish person living in the building was facing the middle of the courtyard, 2 or 3 rows deep, some holding luggage, some holding children, listening to the orders from the Arrow Cross civilians or from the soldiers. Quote, everybody has to surrender their valuables. Place your jewelry in the boxes carried around by these soldiers. Everyone trying to hide any gold or silver in their pockets or their luggage will be shot. All rings must also be surrendered. Yes, including wedding rings. And so it went. A couple of soldiers walked by the lines, and the people dropped their valuables in the boxes, including wedding rings. No one objected. After a while, we were marched out of the building. We were ordered to hold our hands up while walking. I remember walking out of the building into a beautiful summer afternoon, holding my hands up as we turned right on the street. Some locals were standing around watching the herding of the hundreds of Jews from the surrounding buildings. As I passed a short, stocky man elegantly dressed in a brown suit and a hat, shouted at me, "Hold up your hand, you little Bolshevik," as he hit me with his cane. But we were hurried by. He didn't have a second chance. I only had a vague sense of what a Bolshevik was. There were propaganda posters on the streets equating Jews with Bolsheviks, that is, communists. I learned considerably more about communism after the war. We crossed the boulevard and turned left. We were led around the block and were stopped in front of a large freestanding city theater with its steps rising impressively to a grand entrance. The theater was located at one corner of a large park, and we were stopped with front of it facing a small side street that led into the park, through which a steady stream of Jewish people entered the park and disappeared from our sights as they were hurried behind the theater. We saw in one of the groups a couple we knew, friends of my mother's. We were waved to one another as they were driven away. We never saw them again. All those people were herded first to the racetracks as a staging area, then to some railroad station, and were deported to concentration camps. While our group, the people from our building, were made to just stand there for some unknown reason, seemingly forgotten for what seemed to have been the hours on end, fearful yet lucky as it turned out. The fear was not unjustified. Having no control over one's life is sufficient cause for fear. But then there were also all those people passing by and disappearing behind the theater, while we could hear machine gun fire from not too far away. Were those people being killed before the theater, behind the theater? And were we to be next? We didn't know. According to a rumor circulating in the lines, an army unit was battling some guerrillas hunkered down in one of the buildings at the other end of the park. But we had never heard of any guerrillas before. Where could these have come from? Was it just a rumor? Was it for real? I guess was better to believe it. Later, people stopped coming from the side street and the gunfire stopped. This was even scarier as it seemed that the gunfire was connected to the arrival of the Jews. Now we were told to move. Was this our turn to go behind the theater? And then what? But to our surprise, we were not taken in the direction in which the others had disappeared, but in the opposite direction, up the side street, away from the park, away from the theater, out to the boulevard, and made to turn left, hurried along, and in about 20 minutes, we ended up in the great synagogue on Doheny Street, which soon was packed with Jewish people from all over the area. We stayed here for 2 or 3 nights, sleeping in the pews, being served hot soup and whatever else by the Jewish committee, which had been appointed by the Germans as the Hungarian government and made responsible for internal Jewish affairs. Then, without explanation, we were told to go back to our homes. What happened? Historians tell us that Admiral Horthy, the regent of Hungary, who served as head of state from 1920 to October of 1944, finally succeeded to temporarily stop deportations from Budapest in the middle of July 1944. I think this was the day when it must have happened, or when the other order reached the troops operating in our area. But what was explanation for our group being left standing in front of the theater for a long, long time and not ordered to march past the theater and be deported to concentration camp? Sheer luck, you may say, and that's what I thought for years. But now I choose to believe differently. I found that reason only many decades later, when preparing for a Bible study class I read in Exodus, the second book of the Hebrew Bible, the description of the exchange on the mountaintop when God says to Moses, I shall favor whom I shall favor, and I shall show mercy on whom I choose to show mercy. Well, on that day, I guess we were the chosen. A certain part of the city's 7th district was designated as a ghetto, a walled-off area of several square blocks, to which every Jewish person had to relocate by November 15, except if the person held a Schutzpass, a German word for a letter of transit that allowed the holder to pass through the issuing country's territory, some other destination. Of course, there were no countries that accepted Jewish immigrants, so no countries that issued Schutzpasses allowed any of them to enter either, nor did the German and Hungarian authorities allow any Jewish persons to leave the country. So in general practice, a Schutzpass provided the holder with some limited protection if and when the local authorities chose to accept it. But specifically, a Schutzpass allowed the holder to stay out of the ghetto. At the same time, countries that issued such documents arranged for the recipient to move into and live in certain other designated buildings outside of the ghetto in another part of the city along the Danube River. These were called protected buildings. Later, the group of these buildings would be referred to as a ghetto without walls. So the thing was to get a Schutzpass. But how was one to be obtained? Well, that depended on how well connected one was. First and foremost was the paper protection, but it was very, very rare. Then came desirability, came the Swedish protection, still out of reach for our family. Then there was the Spanish protection, but it was so rare we didn't even hear about it at the time. I became aware of it when I saw a movie in New York in 2005 about an Italian living in Budapest at the time who posed as a Spanish official and fooled the authorities. The one that could possibly be obtained was the Swiss protection, run mainly by the local Zionists under the aegis of the Swiss embassy and under the general supervision of a Swiss embassy official by the name of Karl Lotz. The Swiss protection document was possible to obtain because many more than the officially allowed number of these were actually issued. They were not fake documents. They were issued by the Swiss embassy. Simply, more of them were printed than were negotiated with the German authorities. People waited on long lines for days and nights to be allowed inside the office dispensing these precious documents. Meanwhile, those standing on the line outside the building were exposed to sporadic raids by the Arrow Cross conducted against them. My mother and her sister, my Aunt Elizabeth, alternated on the line and managed to get several of these documents to cover our family. It was not possible to find protected buildings that could accommodate all 12 of us, so we had to split up. My mother found an apartment in a building that would take in my grandmother, my mother, my brother, and me. Aunt Elizabeth was also supposed to come to live with us, but instead she decided to go into hiding. But to move grandmother from her apartment to the protected building, we had to hire for her a horse-drawn cart because she had great difficulty walking. A Christian person, a friend of the family, who was a fireman, volunteered to accompany the cart as we thought that uniform would provide some protection for grandma. The rest of us took a chance to use the more and more sporadic and overcrowded public transportation system to get to our location. When we got there, the cart had already arrived, but without grandma. The firemen told us that some Nazi riffraff attacked them, pulled grandma off the cart, and pushed her into the column of Jewish people being marched toward the brick factory, a well-known staging area before deportation. He could not help her. We were sure we lost her, but later at night, she was returned to us by a good Samaritan. After she arrived, she told us her story. She said that after she couldn't walk anymore, she simply sat down on the side of the road. One of the hooligans, she said, started to hit her and shout at her to get up. She replied, and these were her words, "Why do you hit me? Don't you have a mother? Think of her." And the attacker stopped and walked away, leaving her at the roadside. Later, she said a man came and brought her back to us. Around this time, the middle of October 1944, Regent Horthy held a radio address to the nation and the world declaring that the Hungarian government and army would stop all hostilities against the Allies and sue for separate peace. These announcement activities were apparently not very well planned because Regent Horthy's speech on the radio was interrupted and he was immediately placed in house arrest. And her government was taken over by the leader of the Arrow Cross Party, the Hungarian Nazi Party. The persecution of the Jewish population intensified and the deportations were restarted. We experienced terrible overcrowding. Preparation for the rites started in early evening as the whole floor space in the apartment was used for sleeping by those who were assigned to the apartment where we were staying. Every inch was covered with people lying down. During the day, people mostly lined up on the staircase. Food was generally not available. Days went by without eating. Aunt Elizabeth succeeded to smuggle some food for us despite great peril to her person. Later, the protected buildings of the ghetto without wall were no longer regarded as sanctuaries. In early December, some Arrow Cross militia conducted a raid in our building and picked up men between 15 and 60 years of age and women without children between 18 and 50, ostensibly for work. They took away my brother. We didn't see him until after the war was over, when he told us that he had been taken to the Eastern Railroad station and was about to be herded into a cattle car to be deported, when he suddenly decided to feign an epileptic seizure. He collapsed, convulsing on the ground. He was lucky that they left him there alive. Later, he was picked up by a priest and escorted to the ghetto, where he met with two of my uncles and later wives and survived. The letters of protection meant nothing anymore. One day, a man came by and offered to take the children and place them under the protection of the Red Cross. I decided to stay. Another boy, one I befriended there, decided to go, leaving his mother alone. When there was a raid a few days later, she was taken away because she was a childless single woman. A few days later, the Arrow Cross raided the Red Cross building, which was nearby in St. Stephen Park, took the children and shot many of them in the Danube. My friend somehow escaped, came back looking for his mother, who had already been taken to be deported. The city had been surrounded by the Russian army and the noises of the war were getting closer and closer every day and every night. Mortar and gunfire grew louder and louder. We expected the Russians anytime. One morning I woke up to see commotion. Someone must have looked out the window or opened the gate and noticed the Russian soldier in front of the house. Everybody became excited, and so did I, but I was somewhat puzzled that I was not thoroughly elated. I am less surprised at that now. I guess I had dampened my emotions during the years of the reign of terror, for that's what it was for me. So when liberation came, I took it at its stride, somewhat matter-of-factly. Some street fighting continued in the city, and the last German garrison on the top of Gallet Mountain on the Buddha side of the city didn't give up for weeks. When the ghetto was liberated, we reunited with my brother. All the family who moved to grandmother's apartment once earlier survived, although we had to visit. We had to wait for some of them to come home from forced labor camp. Even my two uncles, John and Steve, away for many months, even a year or more, came home fairly soon. My father's family was not so lucky. Uncle Emil and his wife were picked up during a raid in the protected buildings. Yeah.
No, that's what happened with Dad's family. But we also gotta move the microphone because we're missing it.
My father's family was not so lucky. I read this already. We know the following from one of his comrades who survived and told us Uncle Emil's story. It was said, in the last train that left Hungary on December 8, 1944, and ended up in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. It was said that Emil wrote a diary there. In reality, only a small pieces of papers were returned to us, which have been placed in an appropriate museum in Hungary. Deportees in Bergen-Belsen will apparently receive 1 cigarette a day, but because he was not a smoker, he exchanged them for bread. At one point, he recorded how many inches of bread he had in his reserve. Toward the end of the war, it was said his unit was routed all over the remaining parts of Germany to avoid being captured by the Allies, and he was injured during an air raid, suffering damage to his lungs. Only 12 other days later did he receive some care when he was dropped off at the hospital in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. That's where he died in the waning days of the war. His diary contained the following entry in his almost illegible handwriting. April 27, 1945. I am in the camp hospital in Theresienstadt. I am living my last hours. I am extremely weak. I feel I must leave this earth in the last minutes of the war. This pile of paper contains my notes, which are of no significance whatsoever. There were 2 more lines squirreled undecipherable. Aunt Pearl was picked up on the streets of Budapest while attempting to find a protected building for herself and her 7-year-old daughter, and was deported and perished. Aunt Irene and her husband, Ziggy, were caught in what was later called the Death March, to some destination in Germany, after the rolling stock to transport the Jews was no longer available and never returned. And Margaret's husband, who served in the Forced Labor Battalion on the outskirts of the city, was later transferred to Austria and perished in concentration camp. Her son, George, my favorite cousin, who was barely 18 years old, was murdered when his forced labor battalion, the number 101/322, was massacred at the railway station of a small town in the south of the country on October 11, 1944. The unit was ordered to move west, and the Russian army pushed east way west. Their cattle cars were attached to a long train carrying retreating army units and civilians, and when the train pulled into the station, the rumor spread that guerrillas would be attacking the station. Although there was no such attack, the 6 cattle cars with the forced laborers were surrounded by 55 other troops and armed paramilitary. A door was opened in the cattle car and the hand grenade was tossed in. Machine guns started to fire, and when it was over, 198 of the 212 labor campers were dead. 8 were unaccounted for. The 6 which survived were ordered to bury the dead in a mass grave. After the war, the 198 bodies were exhumed, placed in 100 coffins, and transferred to a cemetery in Budapest. There is a monument now where they were buried. I want to close with reading it in my translation from a letter received from my Aunt Margaret, the mother of my cousin George, back in the 1980s, 35 or 40 years after the end of World War II, in which she reflects on the history of her family and on her life. The closing lines of her letter were these, quote, "I often thought that there must be someone or something arranging matters in the world, although I am at a loss to reconcile this idea with what actually took place. Did fate have some purpose in my survival? My brother Emil did not survive, but his wife did. My sister Irene perished, but her 15-year-old daughter lives. My other sister, Pearl, didn't come back, whose husband and her 8-year-old daughter remained alive, and I am left here, who lost both of my husband and my only child. To what end have I survived? Is there some other catastrophe still awaiting me? I have tried to live a good life, but I know that I have made many mistakes. I have experienced happiness since the war, but I have often felt ashamed of it. How could I have been happy after so many calamities? Such is human frailty. I should have lived only for their memory, yet even if I had, I couldn't have resurrected them. I haven't much time left. I will be 80 this year. If I ever reach that day, I might learn what my punishment is for the past. Forgive me for sending such a long letter, but things just kept bubbling up, one thing after another, and I felt really good to write about them because I think of them so often. The other night I had a dream. I dreamt that I was dreaming about them and that I thought I had to tell someone, but when I woke up from my dream, within my real dream, I realized there was no one left to tell. And I cried. I send you my love. Your Aunt Margaret.
Thank you, Peter, for your words today. Thank you for your story. Let's end with the Kaddish and El Malei Rachamim in honor of all of those who have perished. We're going to skip the translation. We're just going to read the Kaddish. I ask everybody to please rise in honor of all of those who have perished. Yitgadal ve'yitgadash meraba be'alma divra chirute ve'amlich malchute b'chayechon u'b'yomechon u'b'chaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'bizman kariv ve'imru amen. Yehi shmei rabba mevorach leolam u'lalmei almaya yitbarach ve'yishtabach ve'yitpa'ar ve'yitromam ve'yitnaseh V'yitadar, v'yitale, v'yitalal, shmei dekudsha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, damiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mama, u'yachaseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imru amen. Please remain standing for El Malei Rachamim. El Malei Rachamim shochein b'amromim hametzei menucha nechona Tachat kanfei Ashchina במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר רקיע מזהירין לנשמות 6,000,000 אחינו ואחיותינו, רבבות אלפי ישראל, אנשים, נשים וטף שנהרגו. אנא בעל הרחמים, יסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, ויצרור ביצרור החיים את נשמתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר Amen. We join together in the English. Page 8, source of all mercy, dwelling in the heights. Find a perfect resting place beneath the wings of the Shekhinah, for the souls of the holy and pure ones who shine like the radiance of the heavens, for the souls of the victims of the Holocaust, in recognition of the acts of righteousness done in their memory. Therefore, may the compassionate one shelter them beneath the wings of the Shekhinah for all time, and may their souls be bound in the bond of everlasting life. The eternal is their inheritance, and may they rest in peace upon their resting places. And let us say, Amen. We'll conclude with Oseh Shalom, page 9. May each of us continue remembering, learning from, and honoring the victims and survivors of the Holocaust. You may be seated. Their stories and experiences serve as powerful reminders of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the darkest times. In a world that is still grappling with hatred, discrimination, and indifference, it is crucial we take the lessons of the Holocaust to heart. Let us strive to be beacons of light, standing up against injustice and fostering understanding and compassion among our fellow human beings. As we leave this sacred space, to the words of Oseh Shalom, let us carry with us the memories of those we have honored today. May their lives inspire us to build a better, more loving world where the horrors of the past will never be repeated. Thank you for joining us today in this solemn commemoration. And may we all work together towards a future filled with peace, unity, and respect for all. Oseh Shalom. And we'll leave in silence. Oseh Shalom Bimroma. Say Shalom Aleinu. Ve'al kol Yisrael. Ve'imru. Imru. Amen. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al kol Yisrael, Ve'al kol Yoshvei Tevel Ve'imru. Amen. We leave in silence. Thank you to everybody who participated today. Thank you for everybody for sharing their stories. And in particular, Peter, thank you. Bernie, thank you. Karen, thank you. And Karine, thank you if you're still there.